Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Murphy, and today we're going to go ahead and start with a new book. This one is called Merchants of Sin by Benjamin Garland. Basically, it goes over the history of obscenity laws and the battles over obscenity that took place in and out of courts for books, comic books, comedy, and film. So, yeah, let's get right into it. Read the author's note here. While I've been preparing this book to be re-released in a more polished edition, the world's leading bookseller, Amazon, has been censoring politically incorrect literature at a breakneck pace. On the first wave of this recent censorship began about a month ago on February 19th, 2019. An article came out in a widely read and syndicated online news site, Quartz, complaining that Amazon was facilitating hate by selling books that the left liberal establishment disagrees with. Within a week or so, these titles began disappearing, one by one. Most notably were the ones written and polished by leading descendant right intellectuals, Greg Johnson and Jared Taylor. None of their books use racially charged language or contain anything one could honestly label as hate. They simply put forth ideas that the establishment doesn't like. Wrongthink, as George Orwell put it in his eerily prophetic dystopian novel, 1984. This book will no doubt be labeled as a work of hate as well, although it contains nothing even remotely hateful. But it does touch on the most forbidden, taboo, and politically incorrect topic of all, Jewish influence. It is about the history of American obscenity laws and regulations and the Jewish role in overturning them as activists and legal experts, as well as the role of Jews in helping to foster the cultural climate necessary for these changes to take place. This is a book not of hyperbole nor exaggeration, but of historical fact. All of my claims are backed up by academic sources, most of which being Jewish scholars. It may also soon be banned from Amazon, or it may not. That probably depends on how popular it gets, how much the censorship crusade accelerates, and whether or not it draws the ire of Jewish pressure groups such as the ADL and the SPLC. As this book notes, a major and incontestable irony is that since the 1960s, Jews and Jewish organizations have been at the forefront of free speech campaigns against the censorship of pornography and obscenity. However, in a remarkable volatile face, we now find Jews and Jewish organizations leading the calls to ban First Amendment protected speech when they disagree with its content. That is one example of Jewish double standards and perfidy which needs to be openly acknowledged and addressed. If Jews are against freedom of speech and at the same time committed to the promotion of degeneracy, why should we accept their claim of holding moral authority? How long are we going to fear challenging them on their blatant hypocrisies? And let's be honest, when it comes to not being able to talk about Jewish influence, it is indeed because of fear. People are terrified, and rightly so. They know their lives, their reputation, their careers will be destroyed. It's a sad state of affairs, but unfortunately this is the reality. I, however, refuse to go along with it. Nobody's going to tell me what I can or cannot say, or what I can or cannot think or write about. Political correctness is a cancer on our society as far as I'm concerned, and it needs to be rooted out. Once it is, then we finally can open a dialogue over these tough questions, rather than letting them simmer underneath the surface. This book was already banned from its first marketplace, Lulu, a long time ago, due to a similar vague notion about hate speech. If it is banned from Amazon, I will make it available somewhere else, and I will also make sure it is available for free online for anyone who wishes to read it, as long as the First Amendment is still the law of the land. Unfortunately, those days may be numbered as well. It may be soon that the entire internet is censored, and the facts presented in this book will be outlawed as hate speech, even in America. If the powerful Jewish lobby groups and their liberal allies ever get their way, that will certainly be the case. This could end up backfiring and blowing back in their faces in a very big way. No topic should be off the table in a supposedly free and open society. Americans value their freedom of speech above all else. Suppression will only lead to hatred and resentment, and if it is allowed to continue unabated, it could one day boil over and take this country down a very dark path. As John F. Kennedy once stated, quote, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." End quote. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Benjamin Garland, April 2019. Introduction. The Jews never faced much anti-Semitism in America. This is due in large part to the underlying ideologies it was founded on, namely universalistic interpretations of Christianity and Enlightenment ideals of freedom, equality, and opportunity for all. These principles, which were arguably created with noble intent and based on the values inherent in a society of European-descended people of high moral character, crippled the defenses of the individualistic-minded white natives and gave the Jews free rein to consolidate power at a rather alarming rate, virtually unchecked. The Jews began emigrating to the United States in waves around 1880, when their population was only about 250,000. Within a decade, that number was nearly double, and by the 1930s, it had shot to 3 to 4 million. Many of these immigrants, if not most, were Eastern European Jews of the nastiest sort, and they immediately became vastly overrepresented among criminals and subversives. In 1908, Police Commissioner report shows that while the Jews made up only a quarter of the population of New York City at that time, they were responsible for 50% of its crime. One of their more common criminal activities has always been the sale and promotion of pornography and smut. Two quotes should suffice in backing up this assertion, one from an anti-Semite and one from a Jew. Firstly, an early opponent of the Jews in America, Greek scholar T.T. Timaeus, wrote in his 1888 book, The Original Mr. Jacobs, that nearly, quote, "all obscene publications are the work of the Jews," end quote. And that the historian of the future, who shall attempt to describe the catalog of the filthy publications issued by the Jews during the last 10 years, will scarcely believe the evidence of his own eyes. Scenes of gross debauchery representing drunken monks in the society of girls, priests, lashing nude women, filthy groups, and other outrageous pictures are displayed on all sides with Jewish effrontery in the windows and stores. One such historian of the future, J. Gertzman, who is himself Jewish and quite proud of his tribe's historic role in peddling obscenity in America, wrote in his 2004 book on that topic, Bookleggers and Smuthounds, that, quote, "Jewish erotica dealers seem to have become prominent in the field soon after the Eastern European immigrants began arriving in the record numbers in 1880. The best evidence of this, apart from the name of offenders, as reported in newspapers, are the listings in the yearly ledgers of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, NYSSV. Gertzman supplies a chart of those who were arrested for obscenity by religion based on the NYSSV records between the years 1882 and 1939. The chart shows a consistent disproportion of Jews and culminates in the shocking and revealing 1939 statistic of 28 Jews, 2 Catholics, and 0 Protestants. He further notes how the figure may be skewed regarding Jewish involvement, given that the religion column was left blank fairly often. And then he gives an example picture. I don't think you guys will be able to see it, but yeah, I got a bad camera. I might have to upgrade that at some point. The above should come to no surprise, as it is fairly well known. fact that the pornography industry in our current day is heavily Jewish. The difference between then and now, though, is that back then it was illegal to peddle smut in this country, and the laws were enforced, while now our society is saturated in it, and the pornographers are almost never prosecuted. This is due to a series of landmark liberalization court cases over obscenity during the past century, along with a general loosening of the attitude on sexual morality, both of which the Jews have played a very heavy hand in. What follows in the series of articles is a brief history of this process in order to give the reader an idea of how we got from then, when traders in pornography were seen and treated as the lowliest of criminals, to now, where the hardest of hardcore porn is accepted to the point where even the children have instant access to it via their laptops and smartphones. Now, while there were, of course, many other crucial elements that helped to bring about the climate in which the liberalization of these laws could take place, the role of Jews can hardly be overstated. They were, if not the most important factor, certainly a necessary and decisive one. We will see that essentially there has been a war going on between whites and Jews, with whites struggling to maintain a clean and decent society, and Jews fighting to make filth and obscenity acceptable. A war which whites have thus far been losing miserably. In order to deal with a problem, I believe it is necessary to locate its source, in order to pull it out at the root. And it is my assertion that the root of our problem with pornography is the toleration of Jews in our midst and our failure to fight against their criminal and subversive tendencies on a collective basis. By this, I mean dealing with them as Jews, as a group, rather than just a collection of individuals, some bad, some good. They themselves operate as a cohesive group and perceive us as a racial enemy and act accordingly with deliberate, calculated attacks designed to weaken us and our civilization, as what weakens us morally in turn gives them more power. This has even been admitted by Jews themselves in moments of candor. Dr. Nathan Abrams, for instance, wrote in the Jewish Quarterly that Jewish involvement in the sex industry is, quote, the result of an atavistic hatred of Christian authority. They are trying to weaken the dominant culture in America by moral subversion, end quote. This seems to be part of an evolutionary strategy that the Jews have adopted over a millennia. Having spent the majority of their history functioning as a hostile racial minority, feeding off of the resources of whichever unfortunate people they were living amongst at any given time. The well-documented parasitism and hostility of the Jews has gotten them kicked out of European countries well over 100 times in the past. They well aware of this fact and are determined to do whatever is necessary to ensure it never happens again. And then shows a picture of where they got kicked out. Again, not a great picture. I'm going to have to do a better job with my camera. Along with being a racial attack, power grab, and survival strategy, another clear motivational factor is, of course, simply economical. Pornography has by far one of the highest profit margins of any business venture, making it the perfect occupation for those lacking a moral objection to it. The sale of vice exploits man's weaknesses, destroys families, and lowers the moral fabric of society, all to the great benefit of a tiny minority of unscrupulous and sleazy men. This is obvious and is why there has been and needs to be restrictions in place in order to prevent it. In part 1, we will look at the Jewish involvement in the early battles over obscenity, including the first landmark case concerning the book Ulysses by James Joyce, and in part 2, we will explore the great comic book scare of the 1940s and 50s. Chapter 1. The battle over obscenity, pornography, and sexual morality begins. Quote, American Jewry has been overwhelmingly antipathetic to the crusade for morality and censorship in the arts and literature, end quote, from Leo Pfeiffer. The first concrete federal anti-obscenity law in America was formulated in 1873. It was called the Comstock Act, and it prohibited the use of the U.S. Postal Service for sending obscene materials. The law came following an upsurge in pornographic pictures among the homesick soldiers in the Civil War, and it was cemented as the basis for obscenity regulation in 1896, after the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of Lou Rosen, a Jew who had been arrested for mailing at the publication Broadway, which featured nude images hidden under a spot that could be wiped away with a piece of bread. The Comstock Act had been written and passed through Congress through the lobbying efforts of Anthony Comstock and marked the beginning of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, of which Comstock was the head of until his death in 1915, when he was succeeded by John S. Sumner. Whether or not an item was obscene was thereafter determined by what was known as the Hicklin test, derived from the 1868 English obscenity case Regina versus Hecklin. The criteria of the Hecklin test deemed as obscene anything tending to, quote, deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences, end quote. Children, degenerates, and criminal elements prone to be negatively influenced by such material were who was in mind with the test. A flood of obscene material, or a flood of obscene literature, coupled with ever intensifying intellectual challenges to the validity of obscenity law, increased over the succeeding decades, concurrent with the burgeoning Jewish population. Finally, a backlash came in the form of the clean books crusade of the 1920s. New York Judge John Ford founded the Clean Books League in 1923 after it was brought to his attention that his 16-year-old daughter had come across some unsettling passages in a book she had acquired from a Manhattan book dealer. Ford, while able to find much support for his campaign among the Catholic and Protestant citizens, was notably, quote, unable to interest Jewish organizations, end quote. Sumner, now head of the NYSSB, personally introduced the Clean Books Bill in 1923. It was defeated pretty much single-handedly by the Jew Horace Liverite. The bill was subsequently introduced and defeated each year until 1929, when it finally fizzled out. Support in favor of strict obscenity regulation had reduced drastically by this time. In Comstock's day, as Paul Boyer writes in his study on the history of obscenity laws, purity in print. The membership of vice societies read like a veritable, quote, who's who of the day, end quote, among the WASP elite. One of the primary causes for the decline in support for obscenity regulation among the white elite was the rise of a Jewish media elite. All of the major publishing houses to directly challenge the NYSSB and the Comstock Act in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and indeed almost all major publishing houses in general by that time were Jewish owned, or at least heavily staffed by Jews. Much like today, where any and all opposition to the Jewish and liberal agenda is silenced through charges of racism, bigotry, hate, anti-Semitism, etc., supporters of obscenity regulation were ridiculed in the media with epithets such as prude and Puritan, while their opponents were portrayed as heroic crusaders for freedom of speech. Attorney Richard Koo, who himself faced a barrage of these insults for daring to prosecute obscenity cases, put it this way in his book Foolish Fig Leaves, quote, Constitution, Bill of Rights, and free speech are all good words, words that create a spirit of 76 feeling. Words such as censorship and blue nose are quite the opposite. They afford appropriate targets for hissing and hooting, end quote. On the legal front, the obscenity battle increasingly came to be fought on constitutional grounds. That obscenity law may be a violation of the First Amendment became the argument. In her book, How Sex Became a Civil Liberty, Leah Ann Wheeler pinpoints the team of lawyers at the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, led by the Jew Morris Ernst, as the ones responsible for initially transforming this argument from a laughable one, as the First Amendment was clearly written to protect political ideas, not obscenity, into an especially formidable and effective strategy. Wheeler, drawing in extensive research into the minutes of ACLU meetings, explains that this was not their honest interpretation of the First Amendment, but rather was a deliberate concocted propaganda tool, a means to an end. Quote, ACLU leaders did not simply discover the true meaning of the U.S. Constitution, rather they created that meaning in a long and painstaking process of negotiation and collaboration that resembled not so much scales falling from the eyes of the blind as stones being laid and turned this way, and that to build a meandering path of uncertain destination. End quote. The ACLU was started in 1920 by the Gentile Roger Baldwin, largely in response to his being jailed by the U.S. government for being a conscientious objector to World War I, which he saw as a violation of his rights to free speech. The organization soon became dominated by radical Jews and remains so to this day. Wheeler notes that while Baldwin and other Gentile board members such as Mary Ware Bennett and John Haynes Holmes, quote, tended to support laws that maintained boundaries between public and private and to tolerate bans on public sexual expression that did not, in their opinion, address issues of public concern. End quote. Other board members such as Elmer Rice, Morris Ernst, and Arthur Garfield Hayes, all Jews by the way, quote, were more concerned about protecting freedom of expression and public access to it, end quote, i.e. the right to openly buy and sell obscene material. The former position is arguably in line with the actual purpose of the First Amendment, while the latter is a blatant perversion of it. In 1928, Ernst published To the Pure, the book that, as Samuel Walker writes in his History of the ACLU, quote, framed the main ideas of the anti-censorship campaign for the next 40 years, end quote. To the Pure made Ernst the most famous lawyer in the fight against obscenity laws and put him and his fellow Jewish lawyers of the ACLU and his law office in Greenbaum, Wolf, and Ernst on the front line of every major obscenity case from then on out. The first landmark victory for the anti-obscenity law activists was the clearing of the importation of the infamous banned book Ulysses by James Joyce, which has as its main character a perverted Jew named Leopold Bloom. Seeing dollar signs and knowing there was a good chance of convincing a court to allow the book because of the challenging cultural climate and the fact that it was already regarded as a classic by many, Jews conspired to intentionally get a copy of Ulysses seized by U.S. Customs. The Jewish owners of the publishing company, Random House, Donald Klopfer and Bennett Kerf, told Ernst that if he would represent them and the book, they would pay all the court costs, and that if Ernst won, he would get a royalty on Ulysses for the rest of his life. Ernst readily agreed to this plot, and in addition wrote an introduction to the book, which ultimately earned him hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties. With the help of other like-minded attorneys, Ernst was able to maneuver the case into the court of the most liberal judge in the New York circuit using a series of deliberate postponements. James Woolsey, a liberal judge, cleared the book as expected. The reason given for his decision was that the book didn't act as an aphrodisiac, i.e., it didn't make him horny reading it, and his decision significantly altered the criteria of the Hicklin test from young and susceptible readers to the average person, while slightly liberalizing alterations to the accepted obscenity standards did continue apace in the lower courts. In addition to the Ulysses decision, it would be over 2 decades before a major ruling would come out of the Supreme Court. the infamous Roth versus United States ruling of 1957, which would make the definition of obscenity so broad as to allow just about anything. In the interim, there was one big obscenity case decided by the Supreme Court, which was regarding the suppression of the book Memoirs of Hecate County in 1948. The ruling was upheld by a split 4-4 vote. Justice Frankfurter recused himself on the grounds that he was friends with the author Edmund Wilson, marking a crushing defeat for the anti-obscenity law crowd and one last big win for Summer, who died 2 years later in 1950. Also in 1948 was the case of Winters versus New York, which was in regard to the 1943 arrest of a Jew, Murray Winters, for selling an offensive comic book. The Supreme Court overturned the case with a 6-3 majority on the grounds that the law, which was called for the suppression of a, quote, a magazine principally made up of news stories of criminal deeds of bloodshed or lust, end quote, was overly vague and indefinite. In part 2, we will explore the fascinating story of the struggle over comic book censorship that took place between 1948 and 1955, and the Jewish involvement in that before getting into the 1957 watershed obscenity decision of Roth versus the United States in part 3. That's it for chapter 1. I will see you all on the next video. Thank you.